Hey folks, this week Dan joins me and we talk with Josh Bressers about Anchore and open source security. We talk about the kernel and its many CVEs, the state of the CVE system in general, what an SBOM is and why you should care, and more. You don't want to miss it, so stay tuned. This is FLOSS Weekly episode 807, recorded Wednesday, October 29th. Bitten by the Penguin. It's time for FLOSS Weekly. That's the show about free, libre, and open source software. I'm your host, Jonathan Bennett, and it's going to be a lot of fun today. We're talking about Anchore and security and open source. Surely that's not a thing anybody has to worry about. That's said a little tongue-in-cheek, for those of you that don't realize. First off, we've got a great co-host today, the wonderful, the original Linux outlaw, Mr. Dan Lynch. Dan, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jonathan, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. We were talking just before we started that this was kind of an early morning for me. So one of two things are going to happen. Either I'm going to get tired and kind of get a little loopy and punch up happy during the end of the show, or my energy level is going to drop and it's going to be real draggy. So we'll see. I'm feeling pretty good at the moment. I've got the go juice, the coffee to keep me going. So
that's good stuff, yeah. And I managed to make it on time, even though the hour's different here. Our clocks have changed in the UK. So it's an hour earlier. I once on FLOSS Weekly with Randall years ago, a long time ago, I turned up an hour late because I didn't realize that the US clocks changed differently to the UK ones.
I remember that.
That was fun.
So when we were setting up up for the show in the past week, I made sure and it sent both you guys an email saying, don't forget time change is a different weekend in the US and the UK. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's no fun to show up to do the show and not have everybody here.
No.
Dan, this is actually a guest that you sort of brought to us, isn't it?
Yeah. So I was at OggCamp recently, which guest of the show only a few weeks ago now. Yeah. You had Gary on to talk about that with Simon as well. And I was at OggCamp and I met my old friend Alan Pope, or Popey as he's known online. And he kind of hooked things up and suggested the guest for today, and I'm really pleased that he did because it's going to be a great show.
Yeah, so we've got Josh Bressers, who is the VP of Security at Anchore. And from what I understand, Anchore does a lot with open source tooling, security tooling around open source, which, I mean, this is sort of a match made in heaven for me. There's a couple of things I really care about, and so I am super interested to hearing about it. Let's go ahead and bring him on. Let me push the right buttons to make that happen. There we go. Josh, welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm super excited.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun. Now, you have a VP of security at Anchore. Let's start with this. What is Anchore? Like, what is the problem space that you guys as a company are in?
Yeah, for sure. So we have a product, an enterprise product built on a foundation of open source. We call ourselves like next generation software composition analysis. Everyone has tons of open source today in their environment. And so we have tools that help you scan into your stuff, basically, figure out what the packages are, and then you can do vulnerability scanning. You can do like policy management and enforcement, things like that. Plug it into your CI system. You know, there's where the U.S. federal space runs us a lot. There's tons of compliance in that universe, and they're running open source absolutely everywhere. And so you've probably heard of things like, like SSDF and STIG and FedRAMP, and like we have a FedRAMP webinar in a couple days to talk about all this stuff. And it's a strange universe, and I've been in open source just literally forever at this point. I mean, more than 20 years. And so it's super fun. We've got these two open source projects, Sift and Gripe, that get quite a lot of attention. Sift is an SBOM scanner. You can point it at containers and directories and whatever you have. It will generate a software bill of materials for kind of whatever. And then you can take that software bill of materials, and that's the thing that you can then, look at for policy enforcement. You can scan it for vulnerabilities. You can just ferret it away for later. Like the famous example is Log4j, right? Where everyone has battle scars from that. Yeah. And if you had a catalog of all your open source, do I have Log4j means you go to the search box and type Log4j, and you're like, oh, there it is over here. Let's go look and see what's going on, versus saying, do we have Log4j? Like, I don't know if we have Log4j. Someone should go find out. Yeah, it's been wild. And in fact, it's funny because I started at Anchore, I think like a month before the Log4j incident happened. And so like it was trial by fire. It was amazing.
Yeah. So Sift is the SBOM finder. What is Gripe then?
Vulnerabilities. So you can either point it at the same artifacts, be it directories, containers, whatever, or you can just hand it an SBOM. And the magic there is so you scan something for an SBOM, right? And your software bill of materials theoretically doesn't change because you've got your container or your release or whatever. But the vulnerabilities do, because there's new vulnerabilities found every day, every week, whatever. And so you need to keep rescanning things for vulnerabilities over and over again. And if you have to scan, let's say like, a multi-100 megabyte container, that can take, 30 seconds, a minute, whatever, depending upon your hardware. Versus if you already done the scan and you have like your software bill of materials, you can usually scan those in milliseconds. And so there's like a huge advantage to just hanging onto those documents. And they're JSON, right? Like maybe a couple megabytes max. And
so Gripe is mainly just going out and looking at known CVEs and comparing it to the software and the versions in your SBOM.
Exactly that. Yes.
Yeah, it seems like the world kind of woke up to the idea of, boy, we really need to know what software we're running. I think Log4j was really, like you say, it was the point where everybody said, oh, hey, SBOMs might be a good idea.
Yeah, for sure. And so I think what happened in Log4j is, you can imagine I've spoken with many people, in corporations and open source, like all over the place. And I think what happened is a lot of organizations didn't realize how much open source they actually had. And the Log4j incident happens and they, send out the minions to go figure out what our open source is. And then they're like, holy crap, where did all this stuff come from? Because, any open source nerd, we knew open source had been taking over the world for literally decades. And we knew it was running everything. But I don't think a lot of the, we'll say, business folk had quite figured out what was going on until Log4j. And so I feel like that is truly the moment all of the businesses, all of the people were like, holy crap, this is just literally everywhere. And I knew some people that were like, can we stop using it? And they were just laughed at. Because like at this point, no, it's completely out of the question, right?
Unless you want to turn all of your logging off for your product.
All of your everything. I mean, it's wild because there's all these surveys that keep coming out. I mean, I think I read one from Red Hat not too long ago where they said 80 to 90% of all enterprise applications are open source underneath. And honestly, I have no doubt at all that that's the case.
Yeah. It seems like all the compliance stuff, you mentioned this sort of almost like an alphabet soup of the compliance things. And some of those I have heard of and some of them I haven't because I'm not in the enterprise or federal space really. But it almost seems like that's the price that we pay for having made it. We're here and open source is not going away, so it's time to play the game the big boys play.
Well, okay, so that's a really good point. So there's a famous blog post. It's called "I Am Not a Supplier." A fellow named Thomas Depierre wrote it back in the Log4j days. It's been I think it's been 2 years now since he wrote it, which is like blowing my mind because I feel like he wrote it a week ago. But in that, he talks about the fact that he was getting these like questionnaires from companies saying, oh, you're my supplier. Do you have Log4j in your stuff? And he's like, I'm not your supplier. Like, I'm some dude who put some software on the internet. Like, that's not the relationship. And I think that's another really wild aspect of this is the open source developers, like they technically don't owe anyone anything, right? But if I'm an enterprise using open source, I'm the one responsible for that. Because, I mean, if you think about open source, I often say it's more like a natural resource, right? Where like you're going to harvest lumber from the forest. You don't ask the forest for things, right? Like you're responsible for the things you get.
Yeah, that's an interesting analogy. This is something that I know the Europeans are having to sort of wrestle with as they're looking at making some legislation about security in software and wrestling with trying to fix that in law.
That's right. And they have two things in Europe that we're keeping our eye on in like the compliance universe is there's the CRA, which is, I do not remember what it stands for anymore. I apologize. But that's the one that's talking about like you need to track your software, you need SBOMs, you kind of need all that stuff. And then there's another directive called NIS2, which is more of a, you're an organization, you're a company, and you have to follow certain cybersecurity requirements and like knowing what you're shipping and providing security updates and things like that are part of that. And one of the challenges in the open source world has been the EU directives initially just said like all software, and the open source people were like, "Whoa, hold on there! Like you
I'm
can't
a
put us in that
hobbyist. How
bucket."
does this work? Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so, I mean, places like the Apache Foundation and the Eclipse Foundation and like the Linux Foundation, they really did a nice job of fixing a lot of those problems. So now there are, there's sections carved out that say like everyone except open source type things, which is good because that's what we want.
Yeah, I mean, our own Simon Phipps was actually part of that. He's in UK, but obviously he would several times went to Brussels and was talking to the people making the laws and trying to educate them on, here's how this thing called open source works, and here's why what you have written, this piece of what you have written in this law just does not reflect reality at all.
That's right. That's right.
And some of the, did I read the entire SEER? It's the Cyber Resilience Act.
That's it. Thank you. Yes.
At one point, I read either parts of it or the whole thing. I can't remember which, for some coverage of it. And like, there's some really good stuff in there.
Yeah.
There's actually some really good stuff in there. Like, if you are making software, like if you are a company that is making software, if you're putting your name on it, you are required to have a security contact. It's mind-blowing how many companies just don't. It's like, oh, I found a security vulnerability. How do I tell them? They don't know.
Yes.
You don't know. Nobody knows. Might as well just drop it on Twitter because there's no better place to do it. You can email their contact at email address, but you'll probably never hear back. If you do hear back, what you hear back will be written by ChatGPT in today's world. I'm experiencing that. Or a lawyer. Or a lawyer. Yes, cease and desist, trying to hack our product.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a little. So what? You guys, the Anchore company. Let's turn back to that for just a second. What's sort of the space that you're primarily focused in? Because it seems like everybody that is in this space has their own niche. We talked with the guys from Workbrew, which that's actually the commercial offering now attached to Homebrew, and
nice.
They were cool. Like that was a great project to talk about. But they've got a very narrow niche, and that is people running open source stuff from Homebrew on Macs at their workplace, and they want to be the guys that own that. We've talked with some other people that are all about JavaScript, the full stack JavaScript, and they want to be able to catch those kind of patch or watch for CVEs in those packages. And there's some places that kind of seem to get left behind, like the actual Linux binaries and packages. There's not as many people working on that, which might be a problem. But what is sort of the niche where Anchore fits in here?
Yeah, so I would say we're a little to the right. You don't hear the word shift right very often, right? It's always shift left, everybody. But the thing we like to do is we work with, we'll say, the operation side of DevOps, because it's like, oh, it's DevSecOps, everybody. But there's still people who are, we'll say, a little more operations than dev in every organization. Mm-hmm. And so what we do is imagine you acquire software from somewhere. It could be internally developed. It could be an external thing. Who knows? Mm-hmm. And you need to deploy it. And so you scan it when you bring it in, and then you know what you have, right? You've got your SBOM. You know what it is. And then there's the vulnerability aspect, which obviously is important these days because, vulnerabilities are in everything. And then also there's the policy. So the intent being that you have all this software kind of flowing into your organization, and then using the tool Anchore has, Anchore Enterprise, it gets scanned, and then there's policy gates, for example. So you can say, like, everything looks good. We can just keep flowing it through the system. Or you can say, oh, something is weird. Like, we're going to stop the train here, and someone's got to go figure out what's going on. And so it's kind of that. And then the other aspect is once you have things like deployed in Kubernetes, we'll say, again, that whole security vulnerability piece, you can say, like, I see all of these containers running in my Kubernetes cluster. Now let's reapply the policy continuously, right? That's like, you always hear about, continuous compliance and things like that. And this is kind of one of those examples where you can get a report every day, every hour, every whatever, and you can look at it and be like, okay, all of my stuff is passing our policy. Or you can be like, oh, holy crap, a bunch of stuff just failed. What's going on? And then the intent is, humans get involved and kind of figure out what's up.
So is Anchore mainly aimed at the container world then? So could I say, here's my Linux server that runs my website. I'm going to, point either the open source tool or Anchore Enterprise at it and say, I want to catalog every package and every binary that's installed on that Linux server, and I want to know when a CVE hits. Is that in scope?
It is not for the enterprise product, but with SIFT you could do that. Yeah, SIFT can scan. Just you can point it at / and it'll find all the binaries. It'll find the packages. It'll find. I mean, so this is actually one of the really interesting points in this whole universe that doesn't get talked about a lot. Is there's no such thing as, let's say, like just a Node application, right? You've got like the Node.js binary that runs it all. You have supporting libraries usually that help with that to work. You've got your packages on the system. You've got maybe some random binary crap someone installed in their direct home directory somewhere. You know, there's like all this random stuff. And so we like SIFT does a pretty good job of finding a lot of it, but there's still some things it can't identify. Because like, for example, if you build your own binary, like maybe we can't catalog that. It just depends how we're detecting it. And so we also have this concept that we're working on. We call it known unknowns, where it's like, I found a thing, but I don't know what it is. So maybe someone should go look at that thing and see, like, is it something we care about, or is it something we can be like, whatever, it's just some random trash someone threw in a directory.
You're almost, that's really interesting. You're almost into the realm of threat detection then with that sort of a capability.
A little bit. I mean, I would say there's some strange overlaps in that regard. You know, everything from like observability, and you've got threat detection and kind of it's one of those, I have all this data, now what do I do with it, right? And in fact, there's a lot of people that take the output of these kind of tools and they just throw them into their Splunk server, their Elastic server, whatever, and then they use it as part of their whole like detection process where they can say like, oh, I've got this evidence, then I can follow it around and see like it started out over here and, you know, that file ended up over there or whatever.
I could see somebody taking these unknown files and just let's do a mass upload of all of them to like Total Virus and see if we get any hits.
Exactly, for sure.
Some super interesting. So you're detecting CVEs. We touched on this briefly before the show started, and I think it'll be real interesting to get your take on this because you wear a couple of different hats. You're not just the Anchor security guy. You're also the open source security guy. You've got a couple of podcasts I think that cover this.
That's right. That's right. I have a podcast called the Open Source Security Podcast. That's actually its name. And we're like 7-8 years into that one. I mean, we're 400 episodes and change at this point. So yeah, I've been doing it for a while. I love it. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. So you have thoughts, I'm sure, on the absolute flood of CVEs coming out of the Linux kernel then.
Yes, I do. In fact, so Greg KH was a guest on my show shortly after he started doing this. And I am a massive fan of the work they're doing. I think the Linux kernel is a great example of kind of doing this right. And it is creating a ton of work, and it's a lot of effort on their part and of the people who receive it. So like if you're on the receiving end of this, I totally get it. You're overworked. It's ridiculously hard to sort through all this stuff. But at the same time, the reality is these are potential problems. And that's fundamentally what we're dealing with when we're talking about like vulnerabilities in software. It's like, this is a risk that we have to understand. And as Greg, so eloquently puts it when he talks about this, is the Linux kernel is run on everything from like milking machines to literal rocket ships. And so they can't say, we know exactly how this software is being used, so we can say this bug doesn't matter. They don't know. And so that's okay. But this is where, as the security people on the receiving end, we need better tools that help us categorize and understand what we're getting. And now there's like 7,000 layers in this. There's everything from the data in the CVE program is absolute crap. And anyone who's ever worked with it that's not like, no one's going to argue with me over that point. Like, we need better data. We need better tools. I mean, this is part of what I'm doing is I'm trying to help build better tools to let us deal with all this data and information in a more coherent way. Like, humans have to get as far out of this process as possible. We're talking about now this year, we're going to see a little over 40,000 CVEs across the industry. And that's probably way too low. I have another thing. I think I sent you guys a link to my blog post where I talk about the size of open source. Like, there are 4 million NPM packages, 40,000 CVEs and 4 million packages, and that's just NPM. Like, that feels a little low. You know what I mean? And so it's quite likely that if we had good data and we had more research and we had the ability, imagine a world where we had 500,000, 1 million CVEs per year. And like all the security people just like, had an accident.
Yes.
But like, that's what we need to think about is like, that's the scale of what we're dealing with. Like, open source is absolutely gigantic. The Linux kernel is absolutely gigantic. And there are a lot of vulnerabilities in this stuff, but we have to learn how to deal with it better. That is our new challenge now. It's not the whole, oh, I'm going to read every CVE and figure out how it affects me. Like, no. We need tools to be able to say, like, this is the CVE you need to look at today. These other, 7,000 that came out don't matter. Don't worry about those. And that it's a really hard problem.
Yeah. So I have mused just a little bit that with the kernel, and so you touched on it. So for those that don't know, what's happened is in the Linux kernel, there's been a push to better report CVEs. And they have essentially come to the point now to where they consider more or less every bug to be a CVE. And they've got a valid point to this, like, because any bug running in the kernel space, because it's so tightly ingrained with the system, there's a really good chance that it can be used maliciously. And so, like, that's a fair point. I have mused that this might be just a little bit of malicious compliance. Do you think maybe just a little bit? There's a little bit of would that be Schadenfreude?
So I thought so at first, actually, but after talking to Greg, I decided no. I think like this is like actually legitimately the right thing to do, which makes me a little sad because the malicious compliance angle like amused me. But
exactly. Yes.
So with this kind of increased, I don't have a good word, verbosity, I'm going to say, which makes me sound clever, but increased verbosity, I suppose, of reporting of CVEs and stuff. Is there a danger that people become less sensitized to them, if you know what I mean? So like the boy that cried wolf or something, do people then start to say, well, these guys are always saying there's something going on? And, do you think that ever happens, that the sheer volume of them now is kind of making people think, oh, this is probably nothing?
I don't think it will because of compliance. I think when you're in any sort of regulated environment, you have auditors that care, and they don't have to do the work, so it's no skin off their back, right? If they have to say, oh, you have to deal with 7,000 of these things a day, like whatever. So I think your point could be valid if it wasn't for regulated industry. Because yes, you could easily say like the Linux kernel is releasing, hundreds of CVEs per week. And actually, I think it's more than hundreds. It's 200 or 300. But yeah, all these CVEs per week, and none of them matter. So I'm just going to completely ignore it. But at the same time, I guess this is actually part of Greg's talking points, is if you just follow current, you don't have to care, right? And I know that's easy to say, just upgrade your kernel. It's not that simple, but if you're trying to follow more closely than we maybe did in the past, that does make a lot of these problems go away. And I think that's part of his intent, is by just having so many and saying like, just follow upstream. Don't try to figure this crap out because it really doesn't matter as long as you upgrade.
That kind of goes back to Jonathan's point about malicious compliance a little bit. Is it a good way of forcing people to follow the latest current kernel and say, or more people to kind of go,
and is it need to get up with? And is it related to the dropping of all of the long-term support kernels? Because nobody used them anyways.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the business model of the distros, right? Is we're going to support this software for decades and everything will be fine, except, we can't do it with the kernel now because it's too big and it's too fast and there's nothing we can do. So yeah, I mean, so dropping the LTS, that's something I watched quite a bit. And I mean, it fundamentally just came down to no one wanted to do the work, right? And I think that's just your classic supply and demand. Like if there's a demand, then find some money or find some people and make it happen, and it's also open source. So you can't be like, oh, those darn Linux developers. Like, no, just go do it. Right. That's how it works.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. Okay. So Josh, I want to back up a little bit and talk, because I know a little bit about security, but I'm not really up on a lot of this stuff. So I, for the benefit of some of our listeners, I know we have a very technical crowd who listen to this show, but some of the laymen, I suppose, can you tell us exactly what an SBOM is and how it, so it's a, am I right in thinking it's a bill of, what's it now? Well, in fact, why am I trying to answer my own question? I don't know what I'm doing there. Can you tell us exactly what an SBOM is and why it's important?
Yeah, I mean, so it's software bill of materials, right? The idea is all of your software has stuff in it. And some of the stuff you wrote, most of the stuff you didn't. And so you have, like, you might have NPM packages, you might have Rust crates in there, you might have Go, whatever. And so basically what a software bill of materials is meant to be is on any system, any application, it catalogs all the stuff in it. So like if you do an npm install and it installs 100 things, those 100 packages would show up in the software bill of materials. And you can also imagine that you can have like different kind of pieces of software where you have a container image, and then you have your software. Those are two different software bill of materials. Now you put them together. Now you have a third software bill of materials that is functionally the other two pasted together. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is just like, it's imagine when you buy something from IKEA, right? They always have that list of all of the parts that should be in the box. And in fact, I don't think IKEA has ever screwed me over on missing parts, but that's the intent here is if I get a piece of software, what are all the pieces in the box essentially? And then we can start asking questions about those pieces. And like one of the really interesting things I like to do is, so if I get an SBOM from somebody, I can look at it and understand it. Now, I should use the word look at loosely, because there's usually thousands and thousands of packages in this stuff. Like I'm kind of an armchair data nerd, so I just put everything in Elasticsearch and then I do stuff from there, which is not, I know that's not how normal people work, and that's okay. That's why we need tooling to help us do this. But anyway, someone gives me an SBOM and says, here's the SBOM for the thing I've built. And then I scan it and then I say, what do I see? Are they the same? Are there things different? Like, did stuff get added somehow no one knows about? Did stuff get removed? How did that happen? And this is like one of the really cool things you can do is you can watch your software as it kind of traverses from the left to the right. And you can be like, why did this file get put here? How did that happen? Or why did we remove these packages over here? I don't understand why we did that. And so there's just all this weird stuff you can start doing and asking questions about your software. Because, I mean, let's face it. For the last, 30, 40, 50 years, the vast majority of software has been kind of YOLO. Where like we type make and we get something out the other end and we're like, I guess that's it. Like, go run that in production. Yeah. It's funny when you think about it, but at the same time, it's like, this stuff is like running the world. Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel like we should know a little more about it.
Yeah. Is there a standard format for SBOMs? Could I take an SBOM that was generated by Sift, for example, and ingest it into another program, another company's tool or another project's tool?
In theory, yes. So,
okay.
So we are kind of early days still. There are two primary SBOM formats. There's something called SPDX and CycloneDX. Mm-hmm. And they basically do the same thing. I mean, I know you can nitpick over, this one does, it records dates a little different or whatever, but it doesn't matter. Fundamentally, they're the same thing. And the intention being that you have interoperability between tools and whatever. Mm-hmm. And some of the tools can do this okay, not all of them can. Because like any good standard, nothing makes sense. So there's tons of wiggle room. And they're working on fixing it. Like SPDX is, I think, 2.6 now. SPDX is 3. CycloneDX, I think, is version 2.6. And they keep adding changes to this stuff. And they're constantly trying to, I guess, bring the formats a little closer together so they work better. Like one of the things Sift does. So Sift, if you run Sift, the default output format is something we call Sift JSON. And it's funny because the SBOM people are like, oh my goodness, did you make a third format? I'm like, no, we did not make a third format. We are basically we just take whatever Sift has in memory and we dump it out to JSON with the intent there is more data in that than either CycloneDX or SPDX collect, with the intention being you can convert between CycloneDX or SPDX. Because like if you have an SPDX document, you can't today convert it to a CycloneDX document. You will lose information because there are those little niggles back and forth. So it's kind of imagine Google Translate where, you keep translating something back and forth and you end up with a hilarious output at the end. Same sort of problem today where it's being worked on. But I mean, you have to remember too, like these formats are not like, it's not old, right? We're still very early days here and it's getting better. Mm-hmm. It's getting better. Thank goodness.
So you mentioned the sheer amount of data and so on. Is there? I'm sorry to have to invoke this, but I'm going to. Is there an application for AI in this where you could use something like an LLM or something and train it with some of this data?
I mean, there's people looking into that for sure. I think it is an excellent question. What can we do with them? Like I haven't seen anything I would say is particularly compelling yet, just because I feel like this data is kind of boring and there's not a lot of wiggle room. Like if an LLM gives you a weird version or a weird package name, that's potentially bad. But I know there's interest today in doing things like saying, okay, I've got this SBOM, I've got all these vulnerabilities in it. You know, what should I start working on first? How can we look at this data and maybe unwind it a little bit using something like an LLM to maybe understand the vulnerabilities and your product? Because like a really good example is, so let's say I have a container image and it has a website open to the internet, right? That is going to have a very different threat model than if I have an application that is downloading a CSV file from a website and then parsing it and uploading it somewhere else, right? And so that's one of the places I've seen some of the LLM efforts look interesting, because you can say like, this is what my application does. Now, you know, based on this information, look at these vulnerability details and tell me which ones sound like they are going to affect me in a very bad way.
You know, I'm aware, because I cover this stuff for Hackaday, that people are using AI in security research, and it's not necessarily going well. It's actually a real problem for open source projects. They are getting, particularly those that have bug bounties, they are getting vulnerability reports that have been generated by AI. And the problem with that, and this is sort of just in general, this is the problem with AI today. They sound very plausible. And these vulnerability reports, they're like very well done, well written, very plausible sounding reports that are totally hallucinated.
Yes.
Is that something that you're seeing more broadly? Is that something that I guess you guys are hooked into to even observe it?
I'm not affected by that in any way. I know some people that have dealt with it, and they've put the hammer down pretty hard because it really, really annoyed them a lot.
Yes.
However, there is some really cool security research I've seen in the LLM universe where you have researchers training up models, the code models, and they're saying like, here is a description of a vulnerability. I want you to write an exploit for this vulnerability against this application right here. And that's been reasonably successful, which is a little terrifying sometimes, because most what's the stat? I think like 3% of vulnerabilities are actually exploited. But with some of this technology, that could, even if it doubled, the workload probably quadruples, right? I don't think we're talking about linear scaling here between the vulnerability rate and the work the security analysts have to do. And so that's kind of a weird, scary part. And then there's also people doing research where they're basically saying, I want you to just take this application and find a cross-site scripting flaw in it. And that works surprisingly well also, which there we start getting into, the whole like 500,000 million CVEs per year. If we have automated discovery, obviously you're going to have, a huge influx of vulnerabilities, which we are not at all prepared for in any reasonable way today.
Yeah, boy, you could imagine a scheme where you take an LLM and you write the prompt that says, find this kind of vulnerability and write an exploit for it. And then you hook that into, on the back end, a fuzzer that actually tests what it spit out. And then if you were to feed that output back into the LLM, and I imagine there are people trying to do this right now, but you actually get a positive reinforcement loop that actually works, because it'll tell the LLM that one worked, that one didn't. And particularly as you start scaling up the speed in which it can churn through that loop. Yeah, that's going to find real vulnerabilities. Of course it will.
So that happened. DARPA had basically a security capture the flag event. And there was an AI. It was originally done by Carnegie Mellon. It was called Mayhem. David Brumley's behind it. He has a company now, and he just changed its name. It used to be For All Secure. I don't remember what they changed it to. But anyway, Mayhem was designed to basically look at like a binary, find problems in the binary. So we're talking about like just operating on straight up binaries. Like we're not even looking at code here. Find problems in binaries, fuzz it, find out how to exploit it, write the exploit, then also write a patch in the binary so the other team can't exploit it against you, and then going and attacking them with the thing you just found, which is like all automated. It's like, holy crap, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, well, so I guess that's the next stage of this. When we finally reach security nirvana, you've also got that. So you would have to write it. You'd have to write a really good test suite, to make sure your program is working correctly. You run through this process I just described to find the vulnerabilities. And then you also tell the LLM to fix the vulnerabilities, and you feed that back into it as well.
I mean,
and as soon as you fix the vulnerability and still pass your test suite, you might have good code on the other end of it.
Yeah, hopefully.
We can dream.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay. So the many vulnerabilities found, lots of CVEs. How are the various organizations and agencies that are responsible for tracking and cataloging these? You've got NIST, you've got MITRE, you've got the NVD. How are they doing with it?
Oh my goodness. So it's been a rough year. So anyone not in this space might not know this, but in February or March of this year, I forget when it was, NIST runs a database called NVD, which stands for National Vulnerability Database. And what they used to do is MITRE, which is a government contractor, runs the CVE program, right? And so people who get CVEs, you get them through MITRE. You can have a company that can assign their own CVEs, but they go through MITRE, or security researchers can just go to MITRE and ask for a CVE. So those all go into MITRE's data set, and that data is very bad, as anyone who's ever looked at it knows. So NIST had a program called NVD, and they would take the MITRE data and they would enrich it. They would add some version information, some package information. They would add severity. They would guess its severity. Their severity scores were often very bad. And they would kind of add this information. And then they just stopped one day, no word or warning, no nothing. And I, in fact, there's a handful of us security nerds who look at this data. And I remember we were like, do you guys did NIST stop? And we're exchanging notes and being like, holy crap, they stopped. There's no new data. What's going on? And then of course we'd email them and crickets, no one knew. And so they just literally fell off the face of the planet for probably 6 months almost.
Goodness.
And then at the same time, you have CISA starts a new program they're calling Vulnrichment. So now CISA started doing some enrichment. NVD has sort of come back and they're doing some enrichment, not everything, but some. There's still a giant black hole in the middle where they didn't do anything. And then you also have MITRE trying to ask the CNAs to do a better job of providing nicer data. So now instead of having 1.5, we'll say, organizations providing not good data, we have 3 organizations all providing, we'll say, incomplete and difficult to use data. And so for vulnerability nerds right now, it's a mess. It's really hard to figure out what to do. It's really hard to understand. I mean, this is a huge challenge we have because obviously we have GRIPE at Anchore, and GRIPE means vulnerability data. And so we've got, a team of people that are doing their best to try to unwind all this and make sense of it. And it's not the most fun. Not the most fun at all we've ever had. But you got to do what you got to do. So I don't know. It just kind of is what it is today.
There's several different directions I want to go with that. First, you mentioned CNAs. What's a CNA?
They call that a CVE numbering authority. That is where, and this is such a freaking mess too sometimes. So
yes.
Curl, which we've all heard of. So the guy behind it, Daniel Bagder, he goes by online. There were all of these CVEs being filed against Curl. And he was upset with them because they were kind of garbage and they shouldn't have been filed. And he tried to get rid of them, but working with NIST and MITRE is an impossibility for the most part. They don't have to listen. Their customer is the U.S. government.
Yeah.
So, no. So anyway, Curl has become a CNA, a CVE numbering authority, with the sole intent of being able to get rid of these crap CVEs and just not have to file them at all.
Yeah.
Which is a super heavy-handed way to just match reality. And the thing is, Daniel's way brighter than a lot of people, and he works on Curl full time, so he can pull this off. But if you're an open source project that you work on an hour a week, there's no way you can do this kind of thing. And so that's one of the complaints I have, is just the fact that all of these organizations, all of this data is just such a one-way black hole that no one knows how it works. No one knows what's going on. I mean, I've been complaining forever that this is exactly the sort of thing that should exist in some sort of open source foundation and have proper bylaws and proper governance, and we understand how everything works and all of that. But I've been screaming into that void for more than 10 years now.
And put it on the blockchain, right? I'm sorry, I couldn't resist.
That will solve everything.
You've got a few companies out there that are trying to pick up some of this. GitHub really comes to mind. I've been involved with a couple of CVEs now that GitHub has been the CNA for, and they've got a lot of automated tools with that. I think they do have some human review in there as well, and that's actually been a really good experience.
They do. So GitHub's doing some very clever things here, actually. Mm-hmm. So they are CNA. They will assign CVEs, but they also have their own data set. They have the GitHub Advisory Database. Mm-hmm. And no, I'm sorry. They kept yelling at me with this. It's the GitHub Vulnerability Database holds GitHub advisories. That's how that works. Okay. Very important to get this right. Yeah. But they have a team of people that what they do. So actually, I said there were 3 organizations. There's kind of 4 if you consider GitHub. Yeah. Where they have a team of people that look at all of the CVEs that affect the ecosystems GitHub cares about. They focus on things like Maven and NPM and Python and Go. And there's a couple of others. Ruby is one of them. And what they do then is they do a really nice job of kind of teasing out what is the ecosystem, what is the package, and what version fixes it. And what I love, though, is if you find an error, you just submit a pull request.
Yes.
And then they either say, yep, that's it, perfect. It'll be like, I don't think this is right. Like, I think this is the thing. And then you can have an actual discussion in the issue, and you can come to a conclusion. And everyone can see it because it's, just GitHub and all in the open. And their data, quite frankly, is the best vulnerability data that exists today. But unfortunately, it's just a subset because obviously they do not have infinite resources to do this. So they purposely constrain themselves. But because of that, it is just so good. It's amazing.
Yeah. So I have tried, by the way. I cover vulnerabilities and I've found typos. One in particular comes to mind. I found a typo in a CVE on... I forget whether this is before or after the switchover. So, maybe it was at MITRE or maybe it was at NIST. Things have moved around a little bit over the last couple of years. I found a typo in what version fixed a vulnerability. Like you go to the vendor's website and they say one thing, you go to the CVE and it says something else. So I'm like, oh, hey, I'll get this fixed. Here, shoot an email off real quick. Surely they'll get it fixed. I still haven't heard back. I bet it's still wrong.
Yes. So I used to do this all the time where I would try to get things fixed. And I've quite frankly just given up. Yeah. Because what it usually is you say, hey, MITRE, and yes, you have you can look at the website, you can see the version, right? Like I have definitive proof this version is wrong. Yeah. And I remember the one blazoned into my mind when I just threw my hands in the air and gave up is I emailed MITRE and I'm like, hey, look at this. Like, here it is. And they said, oh no, you have to go to the CNA that filed that. But who's that? And you couldn't tell. Now they're putting the CNA details in the CVE data, thank goodness. Mm-hmm. But at that time, it wasn't there. So I'm like, who's the freaking CNA? And they're like, oh, it's so-and-so. And it's like, so I have to go email this person. And I sent them an email and they never replied. And I'm like, you know what? This is ridiculous. I'm out. So now when I see problems, I just go to GitHub. I make sure it's correct there. And I'm happy. And that works.
Yeah. So one of the other things that has been a big problem for the industry is the CVSS system, the numbering system, like how severe a problem is. And there's this how shall we say it? It's almost a conflict of interest because the vulnerability researcher is looking for the highest score they can get. Yep. Because sometimes they get more payout, right? Sometimes you get a higher payout because you're working on a bug bounty. So if you find a CVSS 10, you're going to make thousands of dollars. Whereas if you find a CVSS 5.5, you'll get a couple of $100. So there's an incentive. They are incentivized to get a higher CVSS. And then on the other side of it, you've got in some cases the vendors that it's like, they do not want to make the news for having a CVSS of a 10.0. They want that to be a 5. something. And getting those fixed when they're wrong has been such a problem over the years because sometimes they are wildly wrong.
Yes, you're exactly correct. And you have researchers they'll misdescribe the vulnerability. And the thing is NIST has a very limited window into what things should be rated. And additionally, we're using CVSS completely wrong. It's not meant to be a just raw way to score this stuff and then rank it. Mm-hmm. You're supposed to add in other information, like how am I using it in my environment? You know what I mean? Yeah. What does it look like? Is it being exploited? There's actually a system that's newer-ish called EPSS, Exploit Prediction Security System. And EPSS is really cool. What they do is They it's part of first.org is where they kind of, that's where their home is. And they're collecting like all of this data, and it's not all public data, which it's like all of this threat data is super expensive. And the fact that they're getting threat data for free is amazing. So I'm not going to harp on that, but they're kind of getting all this threat data. And what the EPSS score is meant to be is it's meant to be like, what are the odds this vulnerability will be exploited in the next 30 days? And so the intent being things with higher odds, those are things you should look at. And now that's an example where you can, like, if it has a high CVSS and a high EPSS, now we're talking. Like, that's something to look at. But if it has a high CVSS and a low EPSS, it's like, we should probably double check what's going on here because this is weird. Yeah. And so EPSS, I think, has a lot of, I have a lot of hope for it, and they're on, I think, version 2 of the model. Version 3 is coming out very soon, I believe. I might be wrong on that. It might be version 3 or 4. I can't remember. But they have graphs that show how accurate it's been. And when it started out, it kind of sucked, as all things do when they begin. But they're actually doing a really good job now where their prediction models are quite good, and they update it once a day. This is the same idea of, like, you can scan your SBOM for vulnerabilities every day, and it could be different. The EPSS score is going to change every day just because, like, the threat landscape is constantly changing out there in the universe. And so this is one of those things, like, you can look at your EPSS score functionally every day, and you can get a better idea of, like, what do I need to work on? What do I need to worry about? Whereas, like, again, CVSS, once you have a CVSS score, it's kind of set in stone, right? Because that's just how it works. And that doesn't always make sense. Things change. The universe changes around us, and we have to try to adapt to that.
Yeah. I was pretty excited to see the new CVSS 4.0, the new revision of it that's supposed to be a little smarter and, supposed to not give you 10.0 scores for things that are really, really trivial and not actually that serious. And so every time I go to cover a CVE, I go and what's the CVSS 4.0 score? Surely by now it's been out long enough that somebody's using. I have not seen anybody use the CVSS 4.0 scoring for anything. So, like, it theoretically exists.
So the vendors hate it, actually. The secret there is, so for we'll say low and moderate things, it definitely it brings everything to the middle, is what I would say. The high things are coming down, but the low things are coming up. So the vendors hate it because now things that might have been low or moderate are being bumped into moderate or important. And like you said, the vendors have an incentive to lower the severity of things. So from their perspective, CVSS 4 is an anti-feature because it's going to actually create more work for them and their customers.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
So Josh, how many people are working on SIFT and Gripe? What I'm interested in is the community engagement. Are you getting code in from outside of the company? Are you getting pull requests? Are you taking pull requests, that sort of thing?
Yeah, for sure. We definitely are. Like, we love pull requests. We love the community. We've got a discourse. It's all on GitHub. We've got a community meetup every other week, I think it is. The open source team with Popey, they do like a live stream once a week where they kind of do like some of their bug, wrangling to figure out what to do. I mean, we've got a team of, so I think we have a dedicated team of, I don't know, is it 5 people, 6 people? I can't remember exactly what it is. But then obviously you've got more Anchore involved as well. And then, I think we have like hundreds of contributors. I don't remember the number off the top of my head. I'm ill prepared for that question, but
no,
it's pretty impressive, honestly. And we're seeing more and more community involvement, which is a double-edged sword though, right? Because you get more bugs, you get more pull requests, and it's not like, I always love this. Oh, open source will do our free work for us, but like, it's free like a puppy, because you have to, you have to read the bugs, you have to triage the bugs, you have to look at the pull requests and be like, oh, we'd like to do it this way instead, whatever. And it's a lot of work, but it's really cool because we're seeing some pretty cool contributions. In fact, where there's a thing called Bitnami, which is like a container runtime universe. Like they just submitted a giant patch to SIFT to properly catalog and index their containers, which is amazing. Like, that's exactly what we want. We've seen a couple other organizations give us, we call them catalogers in SIFT, which is where we have the ability to be like, oh, this is like, I think it was just a .NET that got added, where it's like, this is, a NuGet repository. So figure out what to do, NuGet cataloger. And we're pretty pleased with how it's going. And that's the dream, right? Is you start an open source project, and ideally you want a community to build up around it, which makes us very excited and very happy.
And I know I shouldn't have I shouldn't really have to ask this question on an open source podcast, but I want to anyway because I think it's always great to get people's opinions. What's the benefits to Anchore in releasing these things as open source? Because we preach it all the time here, but we'd like to let you preach it. I suppose.
All right. All right. So I spent a decade at Red Hat. Mm-hmm. And I spent time at a little Linux startup called Progeny Linux Systems before that, which the Ian Murdoch, the founder of Debian, created a startup, and we'll say it wasn't real successful. but anyway, so I spent a lot of time at Red Hat. So like my career is steeped in open source. And I remember my first job out of college was at a company that wrote life insurance software in COBOL. And this was like right after the .com crash. So it was dire. I'm like, I will literally take any job. and I did. But I remember I'll never forget it. There were people there that were like, this open source stuff is stupid and it's crap and it's never going to catch on and you're wasting your life on it. And of course, being young and filled with, optimism, I was like, oh, no, it's the future. It's going to win. And like, thank goodness it did, because I'd be, probably broke and homeless otherwise. But so the thing is like, Anchore has a bunch of Red Hat DNA in its blood. Like there's a bunch of Red Hat folks that are at the company. And so it's, thank goodness, not something we had to like educate or understand, but fundamentally. So the idea is we've got the bottom of the pyramid is open source. We have Sift and Gripe, and we have a bunch of like this tool called Grant. We've got a whole bunch of other like open source libraries that kind of drive all of this stuff. And then the intent being, by making a tool like Sift and a tool like Gripe open source, you get community contributions are awesome and we love that, but you also get a certain amount of just kind of engagement in the wider universe, right? Where you have people running these tools, you have open source projects running these tools. You've got we just had Alan actually, Popey just did a webinar with Google where Google is scanning like all of their stuff with Sift. They're literally scanning, millions and millions of things every day with Sift. Like that's really cool. They have good feedback, obviously, as well. And that's like the power of open source, right? And then what we did is we took kind of those core functions and we built product on top of that, because it's easy to say, oh, you're going to run Sift across your entire infrastructure. And if you're Google, you can do that because you have an army of engineers. But if you're a small company working on something, or even a medium or even large company working on something, you have to ask, like, is it worth just buying a solution that will do all of the plumbing and all of the monitoring and all of the policy and all that stuff? Or should I hire an army of people that are going to do this as well? That will probably cost somewhere between 3 and 10 times as much as just buying a product. And so that's kind of like that very Red Hat model of there's like that core based functionality, and then there's value added to the top. And we've got support, you've got services, we can help you figure this stuff out because it's weird and hard. And if there's a problem with your data, like open and support issue, and it's going to come to my team and we're going to tell you what's going on. And often we just fix it because it's like, oh yeah, that data's bad. We'll go fix it. And so that's kind of the beauty of that. And yeah, that's what it's been a treat being there, because I don't have to fight for whether they should or shouldn't be open source or whether this is or isn't a good idea. Like everyone totally gets it. And it's awesome.
That is very cool. So I always like to ask people how they got involved in all of this. How did you get into what you do now? How did you get into open source initially, and how did you get into computing even? How far can we go back with this?
You can go pretty far back, man. I'm old. I've been doing this for a long time. I grew up without a computer in the house. I was
punch cards, was it? No.
What's that?
Not quite that far. Not to punch cards.
No, I don't. I didn't have access to punch cards. I would have gladly used them if I could have.
Yeah.
But no, the first computer that came into my house was it was a 386 running MS-DOS, right? So we're talking like early 90s, somewhere in there. Mm-hmm. And I loved computers. I've always loved computers. And I'll never forget you'd go to school and, us old geezers, we had like a couple Apple IIs at the school and we'd do things with them and stuff. And I remember my parents came home from a teacher conference one time and they started yelling at me, and I'm like, what? And they were like, you have to stop helping them with the computers because you don't know what you're doing. I'm like, what do you mean? I know what I'm doing. Because like I knew more about the Apple II than the teachers did, because like I would read anything I could get my hands on that talked about computers, right? And I remember people laugh at me when I tell this story, but like I used to write down basic programs on notebook paper, and I would run the program in my head. I didn't have a computer, so I'd be like, what was this program going to do if we run it? And, I'd write it out and figure out what the program would do, which nothing long, of course, but like, I just always loved it. And so, computing will say for a while, and then this Linux thing you start hearing about. And it's like, wait, I can get free stuff? Like, well, I mean, we'll say a lot of software was free back then if you knew the right people, but this is like, like free compilers. I can get, a nice a Unix terminal that doesn't cost any money and it works and it's awesome. And then I think the real thing that tipped me over the edge was I go to college and they've got Sun workstations everywhere, right? Because I'm an engineer. It's just Sun gear everywhere. And like a Sun workstation was like $45,000, right? They were crazy expensive. Yeah. That's $45,000 in 90s money. So we're talking a lot of money today. And I'll never forget, it was like there was this stuff I wanted to do where there were programs I wanted to run. You had the ability to, do like X windows between systems where you could like run something on the server and you get the X windows window on your system. And I was like, Linux lets me do all this for nothing. Like, this is a no-brainer. And so it was really, I mean, honestly, it was just, I was too poor to buy a Sun workstation. That's kind of what really got me into it. If I had a ton of money, I'd be running Sun gear at the time, but it was Linux. But then, the thing is, it just, it gets you, right? You get that bug of like, oh, I can talk to the people who do this. I can send patches. I can work with them. I can build my own kernel and, completely trash my machine and learn more than I can imagine in the process. And it just, I don't know, I caught that bug and it's just, I love the community. I love how it works. I love everyone helping each other. It's just everything about this universe has been a treat. And like, I've built my life and my career around it. And it's been lovely. I have absolutely no complaints or regrets. And I love open source. It's absolutely amazing. And every day I just think like, what's the next crazy thing that's going to happen? And I'm never disappointed. We'll say that, but yeah, it's fabulous.
Awesome. So I just came up when you were saying that you got bitten by the bug. I was thinking bitten by the penguin. Surely. Yes. You got bitten by a penguin.
Like that.
That's right.
Bitten by a penguin.
The penguins don't have teeth though, do they? So I don't know how quite that would work. But
they have like sharp barbs. I saw a picture one time of the inside of a penguin's mouth. It's like a Lovecraftian horror.
Oh, that's great. All right, we're starting to run out of time here. Is there anything that we didn't ask you about that you want to cover? Make sure folks know about.
Many things.
Yeah, I'm sure.
No, I think the one thing I would say is, so I adore this universe, like the open source security, all that stuff. And if like anything I've talked about catches your interest and it's a topic you'd want to discuss or learn more about or anything, like reach out. I love talking about this stuff. I will talk your ear off if I can. I mean, I have a podcast just because I love it. I actually have two podcasts. We talked about the open source security podcast. My other one I call Hacker History, where I just take like old people and I say, tell me your hacker story, and that's it. And then we learn about crazy things from the days of yore, and that one's super fun. It's tough to find guests, but I'm always looking for guests. So if anyone wants to tell their story, like hit me up there too. And yeah, it's just that's kind of the biggest thing. It's just if you want to have a chat ever, reach out. I would absolutely love to, because there's so much going on. There's so much interesting stuff, and it's just so much fun to talk about. I love it.
I was going to have you make sure and plug your podcast, but I think you just snuck that in there, didn't you?
I did. I'm pretty shameless like that. So
a skilled commentator.
That's right.
In security speak, it was the payload in the.
That's right. Yes, exactly.
Yes.
I got my payload in.
Quickly run off the end of my security knowledge there. I went payload. Yeah.
Okay. Shell code has been executed. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly.
All right. So, what's your favorite then scripting language and editor?
Okay, so I was alive for the VI versus Emacs wars, and I still run VI all the time. Right. It is probably my favorite editor, I think. I use VS Code, we'll say, for anything remotely difficult, but VI still is like, that's where it's at.
It's amazing. It's amazing how many people answer VS Code to that question, either directly or indirectly.
I don't want to, but it works. It does what I need.
It's a good tool.
And then scripting language.
So I know many of your guests, because I listen to the show. There's always is Python a scripting language? And I've been thinking about this like since you booked me. I'm like, should I say Python? And I'm like, I gotta say Python, because the thing is, every problem I have at this point ends up with a Python script to do it. You know, like I'd love to say Shell or like Bash or whatever, but it's Python. Like. It's funny. It's become like the Swiss Army sledgehammer of programming. I think little things are big things. It all works.
It's kind of replacing Perl for that position.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Somewhere Randall just exploded. I thought I heard a faint explosion in the background there.
Yeah, that was Randall.
Yep.
Yeah.
We have discovered recently that any language could be a scripting language if you really want it to badly enough. We had somebody doing the Java for scripting, for system scripting. And,
There you go.
I
remember seashell, right? Like,
yeah,
it exists.
it does. I am in a group right now that one of the guys is a huge C# fan, and I'm sure he does. No, he does. I'm sure he uses
not
it.
C#, seashell. There was a shell from long ago that had a C syntax. But it was a shell. I know, right? Like
I remember that too. Yeah.
We'll say corn shell and flood us all with horrible memories of HP.
Would you like some pain with your pain? It sounds like...
Oh,
that's right.
All right. This has been great. I don't want to let you go. It's been so much fun. We'll have to have you back. I actually wrote a note in our back channel. Like next time we need to do a round table because a guest flakes on us. I'll have to reach out to this guy, and
awesome.
I think our guest from last week we also made that note about. So maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll have a running list of guests and co-hosts, and when we have to scramble, we'll just shoot a mass email out. So this is what we're doing. This is when we're doing it.
Awesome.
It'll be fun. All right. Thank you, man. I appreciate it so much. It's been really good to talk to you. Josh Bressers, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thank you much.
All right. What do you think? What do you think, Dan?
I thought it was great. What a great discussion. As you said, we seem to say this on every show, but we could have kept going for a long time there talking about all kinds. I really thought we were going to get into penguins at the end there, and with the whole penguins and teeth and all that. I could have gone in that direction. I was interested. Something I'll have to ask Josh when he's talking. I'll check his podcast out, the Hacker History one, because I'm really interested in the whole phone freak thing and from the 70s and the 60s and all of that original audio hacking of phone switches and so on. So I'll ask him if he's had any of those kind of people on. Yeah, fascinating guest.
Yeah, that is really interesting history. And if he hasn't, we'll have to make sure and request some. There are still some people out there that are active.
Right. Wow.
That one guy that I follow on Twitter, and he Evan Doorbell is what he goes by, and just some great stuff. The cool thing about Evan is that he was also like he was a phone nerd, but also an audio nerd. And so he has recordings of the phone system from way back in the day. And so like, he's got these narrated clips of, this is what you hear when you do this. And this is what the equipment on the other end is actually doing. And it's really cool. So we'll have clips from like all the different exchanges, and like, here's how this one sounds different from this one. That's why. So Josh, I know he's still listening to us. Josh, if you haven't had him on yet, see about Evan Doorbell and some of those guys. It'd be a lot of fun. All right. Do you want to plug anything, Dan?
I want to, go to my website, danlynch.org, if you want to find out what I'm up to. And I'm going to do a community style plug because I'm one of the people who run our Linux user group in this area. And I think everyone should, the whole Linux user group movement kind of has lost momentum in the UK, and I'd like to say, if you're interested in Linux, have a look, lug.org.uk, find out where your local lug is, or if you're near the Northwest, come to Liverpool. We run Liverpool Lug. We have stuff on every month, so check that out.
The Linux user group scene has just moved online. It's still alive and well. It's just, it happens in Slack and Discord and a little bit in IRC and Telegram and Signal. I have been to Linux user group meetings with people, all like 10 people sat in a room, all hunched over computers like this, just talking to each other online. And I think, why are you here? You could have done this from anywhere. You're not even talking to each other. Anyway, that's just my own personal gripe. Yeah, we nerds we're a weird breed sometimes. All right. Well, thank you, man, for being here. I have a couple of things that I want to plug. And of course, the first off is Hackaday. We've got my security column. If this is not enough security for you, you can get even more of it, week-to-week coverage there. It goes live every Friday. And we also sure appreciate Hackaday being the home for Floss Weekly. There's also the Untitled Linux Show over at Twit. If Linux is more your thing, you can find our weekly musings about that over there. We do not yet have a guest for this upcoming week on the 5th, but on November the 12th, we're talking with Frank Delaporte about Pi4j, which is another Java thing, but it's doing Java on the Raspberry Pi, And specifically, it's about being able to access all of those peripherals, GPIO and SPI and I2C and UART with Java bindings. And so that sort of tickles my interested bone. I've been working with some of that stuff myself here recently. And then one other thing that I will let folks know about is later today in my time. I don't know when all of this will go live, but I'm going to be interviewing with Brody he's got the YouTube channel. Is it just Brody? Brody Talks Linux? I forget what his channel is actually called. You search for Brody, you'll find him. One of the other things he does, though, is he does Tech Over Tea, where he interviews folks. And I commented on something on Twitter/X, and he sent me a PM. He's like, oh, by the way, I've been meaning to invite you to come to this. So that is happening later today. So watch for that if that's something that you will find interesting. We sure appreciate everybody that's here, those that caught us live, those in the Discord making notes and commenting back and forth, and all of y'all that get us on the download. Sure appreciate it. We will see you next week on Floss Weekly.